The sun hovered low over Lake Evergreen, a molten orb of amber fire slipping behind the pine-draped hills. Its reflection shimmered across the water, fractured into millions of tiny golden shards that danced with each gentle ripple. Mist curled around the docks like ghostly fingers, clinging stubbornly to the surface, and the faint scent of wet earth and pine filled the air. It was the kind of evening that made the world feel infinite and fragile all at once, the kind that reminded me why I had chosen this place. My cabin sat perched at the water's edge, a modest, weathered structure that looked more like a storybook home than a fortress, yet it carried all the comforts I needed to escape. Escape from the endless scrutiny of neighbors, from the petty squabbles over landscaping or paint colors, from the kind of small-town politics that bled into every corner of daily life. Here, I had peace, solitude, control. And then there was Karen Whitmore. I should have known she'd find a way to shatter the calm. Karen was the embodiment of entitlement, the sort of person who treated rules as suggestions and authority as a personal inconvenience. Sharp-featured, always impeccably dressed, her voice coated with that syrupy sweetness that somehow carried a threat beneath every word, she had made it her personal mission to haunt me since the day I bought the cabin. And if Karen Whitmore had learned anything in life, it was to arm herself with her most dangerous weapon, her son, Lucas. Lucas Whitmore, 20-something, blonde, arrogant, and spoiled, seemed to have inherited his mother's ruthless sense of entitlement and amplified it with youthful recklessness. Together, they were a force of nature I had no desire to contend with, yet the phone in my hand buzzed insistently, and I knew I had no choice but to answer. Sheriff McCall, Karen's voice came through the line, sweet and dangerous all at once. I just wanted to discuss an arrangement for this weekend. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, feeling a familiar tension coil in my stomach. The kind of tension that told me this wasn't a social call. I'm listening, I said cautiously, already bracing for the inevitable. It's about Lucas, she continued, her tone syrupy, a dangerous undercurrent beneath the polite cadence. He wants to use your cabin for a party. Just for one night. Nothing wild, I assure you. I laughed, low and bitter, the sound not reaching my eyes. Karen, my cabin isn't a venue. It's private property. I'm not renting it out. Oh, come now, Sheriff, she said, her voice dipping into that familiar trap of fake sweetness that carried a hidden threat. Lucas is responsible. It would mean so much to him, to me. Think of it as goodwill. I could feel the tension in my shoulders tighten. The quiet serenity of the lake, the way the air felt suspended between day and night, suddenly seemed fragile, as if it could shatter under her gaze. Goodwill, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. You think a 20-something who throws wild parties is going to treat my cabin with goodwill? Karen, I'm the sheriff. I enforce the law. I don't negotiate with the reckless. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a dangerous silence that carried her calculation like electricity. Then, almost casually, we'll see about that. The words settled in my chest like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. I hung up before I could say anything more, the line going dead with a click that seemed louder than it should have been. I stood on the porch, staring at the water, listening to the faint slap of waves against the dock, and felt the pulse of adrenaline that always came before confrontation. By the time the sun disappeared behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, I had secured the cabin. Windows latched, doors bolted, the old hunting rifle resting by my side, not out of paranoia, but preparation. Years on the force had trained me to recognize the scent of trouble long before it arrived, and every fiber of my being warned me that the weekend would test me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Night settled over the lake like a thick blanket, the stars piercing through the darkness in scattered, brilliant clusters. The forest around the cabin was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the occasional splash of a fish in the water. Normally, these sounds were comforting, but tonight, they carried an undercurrent of threat. Each snapping twig, each rustling shadow could signal the arrival of trouble. I poured myself another coffee and sat on the porch, letting the darkness of the lake wash over me. Memories of previous confrontations with Karen and Lucas floated through my mind. I remembered her letters, polite on the surface but filled with passive-aggressive demands, and Lucas's smirk as he pushed boundaries, testing limits just for the thrill of it. I knew their type, charming on the surface, manipulative underneath, and dangerously convinced that the world owed them what they wanted. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil with it, and I shivered. Not from cold, but from anticipation. They were coming. They always did. And I had to be ready. I checked my gear, flashlight, radio, rifle, all in their proper places. I ran through scenarios in my head: Lucas showing up alone, Lucas with friends, Karen trying to guilt me over the phone or in person. Each possibility ended the same way: firm boundaries, unwavering authority. I was the sheriff. I knew how to handle trouble. I just hoped that was enough. The night deepened, and the mist over the lake thickened, curling around the docks like silent ghosts. It was quiet, deceptive in its calm. The kind of quiet that hides the first tremor of a storm. I took a deep breath, letting the lake's serenity mingle with my own resolve. I could almost imagine the chaos to come with the roar of engines, loud music, the crash of unruly guests. But I also knew something vital: this cabin was mine, and no entitled neighbor or reckless son could take it from me. Not while I was here. And then I heard it, a distant rumble, not the wind, not the wildlife, something else. A sound that set my instincts on high alert. The kind of sound that tells you trouble isn't coming tomorrow, or even tonight, it's already here. I stood up, rifle in hand, listening. The shadows among the trees seemed darker now, the lake itself almost black under the night sky. Somewhere out there, Karen Whitmore was plotting, and Lucas was already dreaming of his party. But I had something they didn't: preparation, authority, and the calm resolve of a man who knew the rules and wasn't afraid to enforce them. The weekend had begun, though none of us knew exactly how it would end. The lake held its breath, the mist clinging stubbornly to the water, and I felt that rare, intoxicating thrill of anticipation, the kind that comes before the first clash, before the law meets chaos, before the entitled learn their lesson. And I waited, in the dark, ready for the storm. The morning sun poured over Lake Evergreen, bouncing off the water like molten glass, yet the serenity of the day felt fragile, as though the previous night's calm had been nothing more than a prelude to chaos. The cabin, normally a sanctuary, seemed to lean into the tension, its wooden siding weathered but proud, creaking faintly as though warning me that this weekend would be different. I was on the porch, sipping black coffee, listening to the faint hum of insects in the air, when the sound of engines broke the silence. Low, throaty rumbles that grew steadily louder, carrying with them the unmistakable scent of gasoline and arrogance. I set the coffee down, eyes narrowing. It wasn't long before the first Jeep appeared over the hill, Lucas Whitmore at the wheel, a smug grin plastered across his face. His blonde hair caught the sunlight, almost glowing like a halo of entitlement. Behind him, a caravan of sleek, polished cars disgorged a parade of 20-somethings laughing, shouting, carrying coolers and folding chairs, each one looking like they had stepped straight out of a college party brochure. I stepped off the porch, letting the rifle rest casually against my shoulder, and squared my shoulders. Lucas Whitmore. This is your first and last warning. Move along. He froze for a fraction of a second, then smirked. Sheriff McCall. Didn't expect the big man of the law to be watching over his little paradise. His voice was light, teasing, but I could feel the challenge in it. Mom said you might let me have the cabin, for just one night. She's very persuasive. I narrowed my eyes. Your mother can say whatever she likes. This cabin is private property. The answer is no. Lucas laughed, a sharp, careless sound that bounced off the lake and echoed into the surrounding forest. Come on, Sheriff. Just one night. Everyone wants a little fun. Don't you want the town to like you? I let the silence stretch, the only sounds the distant slap of waves against the dock and the rustle of the pine trees. This isn't about what anyone wants, I said finally. This is about what's legal and safe. And letting a bunch of drunk kids run wild in my cabin? Not happening. Lucas's smirk faltered, replaced with a glimmer of irritation. You're really going to deny me, huh? Come on, you know Mom's got connections. She can. Lucas, I interrupted, my voice low but sharp, I don't care what your mother says. This cabin is private property. Trespassers will be arrested. End of story. He leaned casually against the railing of the porch, as if the cabin itself was his personal playground. Arrest me, he asked, amusement dancing in his eyes. Sheriff, that'd be dramatic. Fun, even. For a long moment, I stared at him, weighing my options. He was reckless, young, and dangerous when combined with his mother's influence. But I had something on my side that Lucas couldn't buy: charm, or intimidate, authority. I had the law in my corner, and I wasn't afraid to use it. Try me, I said. That was enough to make him step back, though not entirely. He exchanged a look with his friends, who were now unloading coolers and setting up loudspeakers, but even their bravado faltered when they realized I wasn't bluffing. By midday, they had transformed the area around the cabin into a chaotic, half-organized mess. Lights strung between trees, folding tables scattered across the lawn, and a speaker blasting music that rattled the window panes. I moved among the trees, staying in shadow, watching and listening. Every step, every misstep, every careless laugh was a test of patience, and I was the unblinking eye of authority. Then the first warning came. One of Lucas's friends, a tall kid with dark hair and a hoodie, stumbled near the dock. He lost his balance, teetering dangerously over the water, and for a heartbeat, I imagined him plunging into the lake. Without thinking, I sprinted down the slight slope, catching him by the collar and hauling him to solid ground. The others froze, stunned. "That's your first and only warning," I said, voice low, deadly serious. "Step out of line, and you'll regret it." Lucas's face flickered, not with fear but with calculation. I could almost see the gears turning behind those blue eyes. He was smart, and he knew he couldn't win by force. He'd have to try manipulation, charm, or sheer arrogance. But none of that mattered when the law was standing, solid, and unyielding. The day stretched on, heavy with heat and tension. I patrolled the boundaries, moving silently through the trees, watching as the party raged just beyond my threshold. Laughter, shouts, and the pulsing beat of music made my skin crawl, but I didn't waver. Every misstep, every trespasser, I intercepted. Every spilled drink on my lawn or careless sprint toward the dock, I corrected. And yet, despite my vigilance, the chaos had a way of seeping into the edges of my sanctuary. Coolers toppled, beer cans rolled across the grass, and a group of kids tried to sneak onto the dock for a water challenge that could have ended badly. I caught them in time, hauling the ringleader back to solid ground. "You think this is funny?" I barked, my patience thinning. "This is my property. One more stunt, and I swear you'll regret it." By the time the sun began to dip behind the hills, the tension had reached its peak. Lucas, for all his bravado, had started to realize that I wasn't just a man with a gun and authority, I was a sheriff who knew his limits and would enforce them without hesitation. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the armor of arrogance he had worn all day. Night came quickly over Lake Evergreen, turning the water into a mirror of black glass. The party continued, but I kept to the shadows, moving silently, a sentinel watching over my property. I didn't need to confront them directly anymore, they were aware of my presence. Every thump of the bass, every shout of drunken laughter, every crash of a cooler landing on the grass reminded them that they weren't in control. Hours passed, and fatigue began to set in, not in them, but in me. I had patrolled, warned, and corrected, maintaining a careful balance between authority and patience. But I was prepared. Always prepared. Then came the unexpected. One of the kids, drunk and emboldened, tried to sneak onto the dock with a case of beer. I caught him halfway across, grabbing his arm and yanking him back. The others froze, realizing that the sheriff wasn't bluffing. "This ends now," I said, voice low and dangerous. "Pack up and go, or face consequences. I will not repeat myself." Lucas's smirk faltered. He looked at his friends, then at me, the first real fear flickering in his eyes. He had no idea how far I was willing to go, how seriously I treated my property and the law. I realized then that the weekend wasn't just a test of patience, it was a test of wills. And I was willing to see it through to the end. As I stood on the porch, watching the last traces of daylight fade into night, the lake calm once more but heavy with anticipation, I felt a grim satisfaction. The law was still standing, my property still mine, and the Whitmore's chaos contained, for now. But I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The storm was coming. And I was ready. Saturday dawned heavy and humid over Lake Evergreen, the sunlight striking the water like molten silver. Mist clung to the shoreline, curling lazily over the docks, and the air carried faint traces of last night's chaos, spilled beer, crushed grass, and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke. The lake itself was calm, serene, almost mocking, as if it knew that the storm of human arrogance had passed, and yet, its stillness carried an unspoken warning. I was on the porch, surveying the scene, every muscle tense, every sense alert. Lucas Whitmore and his entourage had left their mark, a few discarded cups, a twisted folding chair, but more importantly, they had left behind tension. The Whitmores were not the type to admit defeat easily. Karen, especially, was a woman accustomed to bending rules and people to her will. It didn't take long to see her coming. The rumble of her SUV announced her arrival before she appeared, tires crunching gravel like a drumbeat of fury. Karen Whitmore stormed toward me, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression the very definition of righteous indignation. "Sheriff McCall," she barked, voice sharp, slicing through the humid morning air. "How dare you interfere with my son's plans? He's a Whitmore, Anne." I cut her off, stepping toward her with the authority I carried like armor. "He's a trespasser, Karen. That's all that matters. Your son broke the law, and I'm enforcing it. Nothing personal. Just justice." Her lips curled, a mix of rage and disbelief, but before she could argue further, Lucas appeared behind her, his usual smirk replaced with something more cautious, hesitation, even fear. The first cracks in his bravado had shown yesterday, but now they were fully exposed. You really won't let it happen, Sheriff?" he asked, voice quiet, almost pleading. There was no trace of the cocky arrogance that had defined him the day before, no smugness left in his gaze. I nodded. "Not on my watch. Not here. Not ever." For a moment, silence hung over the cabin like a shroud. Karen's fury radiated in waves, but she realized that her attempts to intimidate me had failed. Lucas's friends, lingering nearby, shifted uneasily, the lesson of consequences sinking in. The air was thick with tension, but also a strange sense of inevitability. The Whitmores were learning, perhaps for the first time, that life didn't bend around entitlement. I reached for my radio, calling in backup. The distant wail of sirens soon punctuated the morning stillness. A squad car rounded the bend, and within minutes, the Whitmores were officially cited for trespassing and noise violations. Karen's protests fell flat against the unyielding authority of the law. She stumped, screamed, and waved her arms like a conductor of chaos, but it made no difference. Lucas hung back, his shoulders slumping as the officer explained the citations. The weight of reality pressed down on him, authority, accountability, and the limits of influence. For the first time, I saw the cost of arrogance in his eyes. With the property cleared, I moved along the dock, letting the water lap against the posts, its calm surface reflecting the golden sunlight. The lake had returned to its quiet, indifferent state, as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. The events of the past 24 hours had left a mark, a memory of boundaries enforced, of authority unshaken. Karen Whitmore finally retreated to her SUV, her face red with rage and humiliation. She revved the engine, blaring one last time before disappearing down the winding road, leaving her son in a haze of confusion and new understanding. Lucas followed silently, a stark contrast to the confidence he had arrived with. He had learned a lesson: the world doesn't owe you anything, and arrogance can't shield you from consequences. I leaned against the railing, watching the lake shimmer in the afternoon sun. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, carrying the peace that had been restored. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, I allowed myself to breathe, the adrenaline of confrontation fading like the echo of a distant storm. This cabin, my refuge, my sanctuary, was mine again. The chaos of entitlement, the reckless behavior of youth, had been contained. I had not only defended my property but reaffirmed the law, the order that many in this town took for granted. The lesson had been delivered without violence, without hysteria, but with firm, unwavering authority. As I walked along the shoreline, the dock creaking under my boots, I couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past 2 days. Karen's attempts to manipulate, Lucas's reckless defiance, the wild, lawless energy of the party, they had all collided against the immovable wall of my resolve. And for once, it had been enough. I paused at the end of the dock, letting the sun glint on the lake one last time before dipping behind the hills. The mist rose faintly, curling like a protective shroud over the water. It was quiet now, serene, as if the lake itself approved of the outcome. The Whitmore's influence had been checked, their arrogance tempered. And for now, peace reigned. The sheriff and me remained vigilant, of course. I knew the Whitmores would try again, in some form or another. Karen's persistence was legendary, and Lucas's youth made him prone to future mischief. But I also knew something important: authority, when exercised with calm confidence and unwavering resolve, could withstand even the most entitled storms. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat back on the porch, feeling the heat of the afternoon sun on my shoulders. The lake glistened, the air filled with the sound of distant birds and the occasional splash of a fish. The weekend had tested me in ways I hadn't expected, but I had emerged unshaken. My cabin, my rules, and my authority had endured. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a faint smile. Lake Evergreen had returned to its peaceful rhythm, and I had reclaimed more than just my property. I had reclaimed my serenity, my control, and the reminder that some things were worth standing firm for, no matter the opposition. As the sun finally sank behind the hills, turning the sky into a canvas of gold, purple, and pink, I felt the weight of the ordeal lift. The Whitmores were gone, and the lake, indifferent yet forgiving, reflected the quiet satisfaction of a battle won without surrender, a confrontation resolved without compromise. I sat back, sipping my coffee, letting the gentle lap of water against the dock soothe the remnants of tension. The sheriff in me remained alert, of course, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free to enjoy my cabin, free to enjoy the lake, and free to watch the sunset without fear of entitlement barging through my front door. Lake Evergreen had endured countless storms before, and it would endure countless more. But this weekend, it had witnessed a battle of wills, one where the law had stood firm and the entitled had learned, at last, that some things were not up for negotiation. And as the last light of day faded into twilight, I knew, with quiet certainty, that peace would last at least until the next storm came knocking.